Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be reading chapter 3 in our Flat Stanley book, and let's go ahead and start off like we always do, reading the questions first. So in chapter 3, it's called Stanley the Kite. We're going to go ahead, pull up our screen. Let's see here. Stanley the Kite. I wonder what that's about. All right, so number 1, why did Arthur get mad? Was it A, Stanley was better at baseball than Arthur? B, he had to walk while Stanley was carried? Or C, Stanley did not have to help around the house? Number 2, one advantage to being rolled up was Stanley, A, could roll down the yard, B, could see the city better, or C, didn't get wet when it rained. Number 3, Arthur tried to make himself flat by A, crawling under the bulletin board, B, piling encyclopedias on top of himself, or C, sliding through the crack in the door. Number 4, the next Sunday at the park, Stanley A rolled himself up so that others could use him as a bat. B flew in the air as a kite. C became a hoop toy. Number 5, while Arthur ate a hot dog, Stanley A went home. B fell in the lake. C rolled down the hill, or D became tangled in a tree. And number 6, the main idea of this chapter is A, Stanley becomes a human kite. B, Arthur and Stanley become mad at each other. C, hot dogs are fun to eat. D, going to the park is fun. All right, let's go ahead and read our story. Chapter 3, Stanley the Kite. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string itself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. A parcel is a package. And they're just strolling down the street like that. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see you bought some wallpaper," Mr. Jones said. "Gonna decorate your house, I suppose." "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller," the man said. "George," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top of his class at school." That means out of all the kids, he's the third smartest. "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said. "And he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. Boys and girls, when Mrs. Reed was a little girl, I was never a little boy. When Mrs. Reed was a little girl, we didn't have the internet. And the way we did research projects was in these big books called encyclopedias. And they had so much information. So they're really big, thick, heavy books. But now you have the computer and you have the internet to research all your stuff. It hasn't always been like that. So he piled all those books on him, hoping he would become flat. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." Think you could flatten yourself out like that? Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help but being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails, made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. Someday, he said, I'll have a big kite and I'll win a kite flying contest and I'll be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days. Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. You can fly me, Arthur, he said. Come on. He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, up, up. Up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully, a little bit at a time, so that it didn't hold him. Then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Wow. I'm afraid of heights. I think that would be really scary. What about you? Arthur let out all the string and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood and stared. Stanley swooped right and then left in long, matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley of Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in a fork of the tree. He didn't notice while he was eating the hot dog that the wind was blowing the string and got tangled in the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley didn't realize how low he was until the leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries, and they climbed up to set him free. No, he was stuck in that tree for 15 minutes. Stanley wouldn't speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. If you're cross, you're mad or angry. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. We're at the office all day, having fun, she said. You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult. Well, kids are like that, said Mr. Lambchop. Phases. Be patient, dear. And that is the end of chapter 3. So go ahead, go do your questions. And then next time we meet, we will read chapter 4, Museum Thieves.